Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird is an absolute classic, right? But to really grasp the immense weight of this narrative, we can't just look at the pages. We need to illuminate the deep historical and personal contexts that built the world of Maycomb. So let's explore the history behind the fiction. There's this famous line from Atticus Finch where he says, "The one thing that doesn't abide by majority rule is a person's conscience." That single sentence perfectly captures the core struggle of our entire journey today. The incredibly difficult and honestly often dangerous exercise of moral courage against deeply entrenched societal norms. To truly unpack this dense, multi-layered story, we're going to zoom in and out today. We'll look at the historical roots of injustice, the unwritten rules of Maycomb, real-life parallels, the civil rights era context, and finally, the novel's lasting legacy. Part 1, the historical roots of injustice and the deep history shaping the 1930s South. You know, the oppressive environment in this novel didn't just appear out of thin air. It was built on literal centuries of trauma. We're talking about the long-lasting racial hierarchy established by the transatlantic slave trade, moving through a civil war that ended slavery, but definitely not prejudice, right into the collapse of Reconstruction. And by the time we hit the Great Depression in the 1930s, which is exactly when our story takes place, economic collapse had sharpened those racial divides even more. Poor white communities were fiercely terrified of job competition. This whole era was defined by a really bitter contradiction. On paper, you had the 14th Amendment guaranteeing equal protection, and the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson case legalized segregation under the guise of separate but equal. But in reality, come on, it was anything but equal. Black Americans were facing systemic violence, total disenfranchisement through rigged literacy tests and poll taxes, and just starkly inferior facilities. And legal segregation wasn't just some high-level, abstract government concept. It infiltrated literally every single aspect of daily life, right down to the drinking fountains. The doctrine provided legal cover, sure, but the actual lived reality was one of constant indignity. Moving on to Part 2, the unwritten rules of Maycomb and the rigid social codes of a fictional town. So the town of Maycomb is deeply, deeply divided. Economic hardship from the Depression created this rigid hierarchy where class was just as important as race in defining your worth. At the very top, you've got wealthy professionals like the Finches and Judge Taylor who hold all the power. Below them are the poor farmers like the Cunninghams. Now, they're incredibly poor, but they're proud and highly valued for their honesty. Then you have the so-called white trash like the Ewells, living in squalor and relying on welfare. The town completely despises them, yet because of how the racial hierarchy works, they still socially rank above the black residents who are systematically oppressed and forced into menial labor. But beyond the actual laws, Maycomb is ruled by insular customs and incredibly strict social taboos. For example, rigid gender expectations. Women are supposed to be domestic and ladylike, which explains why Scout gets so much grief for being a tomboy. There's also this deep fear of the unknown, which leads to the whole town mythologizing outsiders like Boo Radley. Add in rampant gossip that forces everyone to conform, and deep religious hypocrisy where faith is often used to justify prejudice. All of this feeds into a massive fear of upsetting the racial and social balance. You break these unwritten rules and the entire community judges you harshly. Okay, Part 3, real-life parallels and inspirations. Let's look at the true stories behind the fiction. You see, the authenticity of this novel stems directly from Harper Lee's own life. She was born in 1926 in Monroeville, Alabama, which, surprise, as the direct model for Maycomb. Her dad, Amasa Coleman Lee, was a lawyer and newspaper editor who actually once defended black clients. Sound familiar? Yep, he was the clear inspiration for Atticus Finch. And here's a fun literary Easter egg for you. Dill, the quirky childhood friend, was actually based on Lee's real-life next-door neighbor, who just happened to be the future literary icon Truman Capote. Lee essentially poured her own observations of strict class divides and stifling small-town gossip right onto the page. Now, I want you to focus on a number for a second. The number 9. That number represents the 9 black teenagers in the tragic 1931 Scottsboro boys' trial. They were falsely accused of assaulting 2 white women on a train near Scottsboro, Alabama. Despite a total lack of credible evidence, one of the accusers even retracted her statement later, all white juries quickly convicted most of them in a series of rush trials. Several were even sentenced to death. This severe miscarriage of justice became a massive symbol of racial injustice in the South. And it directly mirrors the fate of Tom Robinson in the novel, showing exactly how white juries systematically valued a white accuser's word over a black person's testimony. And this brings us to a really dark truth about systemic failure. When the legal system wasn't enough to oppress Black citizens, mob violence stepped in. Just to put this in perspective, between 1882 and 1951, over 3,400 African Americans were lynched. The terrifying mob scene at the jail in the novel directly echoes these historical lynch mobs. It shows how racial violence served as a brutal, literal enforcement mechanism for the social hierarchy of the Jim Crow South. Let's zoom out a bit for Part 4, the Civil Rights Era context, and what it meant to publish during a pivotal struggle. This is a super vital piece of context that often gets overlooked. The novel is set in the 1930s, right? But it was published in the explosive heart of the civil rights movement. Think about the timeline for a second. In 1954, Brown v. Board of Education ends school segregation. Right after that, the Montgomery bus boycott kicks off. Then, right in the middle of this massive, historic societal shift in 1960, To Kill a Mockingbird hits the shelves. This was just a few years before the 1964 Civil Rights Act finally outlawed segregation in public spaces. By publishing exactly when she did, Harper Lee did something really clever. She forced her 1960s readers to look backward at the 1930s South, and in doing so, forced them to confront the ongoing racism and injustice happening in their very own time. The book helped frame civil rights issues for a broad, mostly white audience, and it actually contributed to shifting attitudes about racial justice in America. It perfectly bridged a deeply personal, fictional narrative with a massive national political struggle. Finally, Part 5, the novel's lasting legacy and why we still read it today. Decades later, this book remains an absolute staple in curriculums worldwide. Why? Because the historical mass protests for justice back then still echo directly into the classroom discussions happening right now. The book's core themes, empathy, prejudice, standing up for what is right, they haven't aged a day. They've just taken on new contexts. And today's readers are engaging with the text in some incredibly nuanced ways, recognizing both its historical importance and its limitations. For instance, contemporary critics rightly point out the white savior narrative centered around Atticus and the lack of true agency for the Black characters in the story. Yet, readers still draw very clear, undeniable lines between Tom Robinson's trial and contemporary issues. The systemic racial injustice and police brutality highlighted by the Black Lives Matter movement find stark echoes in Macomb's justice system. Even the Me Too movement connects deeply to the novel's exploration of victim credibility, societal treatment of accusations, and massive power imbalances. So, I'll leave you with this thought to ponder today. Knowing what you know now about the historical roots of Macomb, the rigid social taboos, and the profound courage it takes to face deeply embedded prejudice, how will you stand up for what's right in your own world? How will you challenge the unwritten rules of your society today? Think on that and keep seeking the truth. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.